There's a specific list of experiences that almost never gets talked about accurately, because most content about spiritual awakening either romanticizes it into something purely blissful or treats it so vaguely that nobody can actually recognize it happening in their own life. Today we're covering 7 specific, concrete things that people who've genuinely gone through a spiritual awakening consistently report, not vague, mystical language, but recognizable, describable shifts that mark this process as something real rather than simply a trend or an aesthetic borrowed from spirituality without any actual substance behind it. Let's start with something important before going through the list. Spiritual awakening, in the sense we're using it today, isn't necessarily religious, and it doesn't require any particular belief system to be part of the experience. What we're describing is a psychological and perceptual shift, a fundamental change in how someone relates to their own mind, their own suffering, and the nature of reality itself. This shift can happen within any religious tradition, within no tradition at all, or through experiences that have nothing to do with organized spirituality in any conventional sense. What matters isn't the framework someone uses to describe it. What matters is whether these 7 specific experiences are actually present. The first thing, a sudden, often disorienting collapse of the sense that your thoughts are automatically true simply because you're thinking them. Before this shift, most people live inside their own thinking almost completely, experiencing every thought as an accurate report on reality, rarely questioning the automatic narration running constantly in the background of consciousness. Awakening produces a specific, recognizable break in this automatic trust, a moment, sometimes sudden, sometimes gradual, where a person notices clearly that thoughts are simply arising, appearing, passing through, rather than being the voice of some absolute, reliable truth. This isn't the same as becoming unable to trust your own mind. It's something more specific, recognizing thought as a process happening, rather than as an infallible narrator, whose every conclusion deserves automatic belief. This shift tends to be genuinely disorienting at first, precisely because so much of ordinary functioning depends on trusting your own thinking without question. But once it settles, it produces something remarkable: the ability to notice anxious, catastrophic, or self-critical thoughts arising without being immediately, completely pulled into believing and acting on them simply because they showed up. This single shift, on its own, tends to reduce an enormous amount of suffering that most people assume is simply an unavoidable part of having a mind at all. The second thing, a genuine, often startling sense of the constructed nature of identity, the recognition that who you are is, in significant part, a story that's been continuously assembled, revised, and maintained rather than a fixed, solid, unchanging fact about reality. This tends to arrive as a specific, often unsettling realization. The version of yourself you've been protecting, defending, and organizing your entire life around is, in a real sense, a narrative construction built from memory, habit, and repeated self-description, rather than something as solid and unchangeable as it always felt while you were fully inside it. This particular shift often produces genuine fear initially, because it can feel, in the moment it arrives, like losing something essential rather than gaining clarity. But for people who move through this stage fully rather than retreating from it, something valuable eventually emerges: a significant reduction in the exhausting, constant work of defending, maintaining, and protecting a fixed self-image, because that self-image is finally understood as something more fluid and less fragile than it previously seemed. The third thing, an increased, sometimes overwhelming capacity to feel the suffering of other people and other beings, arriving alongside a corresponding decrease in the specific kind of self-focused anxiety that used to dominate most of a person's attention. This shift often surprises people because they expected spiritual awakening to produce more peace, more detachment, more distance from difficult emotion, and instead find themselves feeling more, not less, particularly regarding suffering that exists beyond their own personal circumstances. This isn't a contradiction. It reflects something specific. As the intense, narrow focus on personal, self-referential concern begins to loosen, attention that used to be almost entirely consumed by one's own situation becomes available to notice and genuinely feel what's happening to everyone else as well. The fourth thing, a specific, often disorienting shift in the experience of time, where the usual constant mental movement between rehearsing the past and anticipating the future noticeably decreases, replaced by a markedly increased capacity to actually be present in whatever's happening right now. This isn't simply an intellectual understanding that the present moment matters. Most people already believe that conceptually without it changing their actual lived experience at all. This is a genuine, felt shift in where attention actually rests, moment to moment, and it tends to be one of the more immediately noticeable changes people report because it changes the basic texture of ordinary daily experience so significantly. The fifth thing, the emergence of what's often described as a kind of underlying stability or groundedness that doesn't depend on external circumstances going well. This is one of the more counterintuitive aspects of genuine awakening because it doesn't mean external circumstances stop mattering or that difficult events stop being genuinely difficult. What changes is the presence of something steadier underneath the difficulty, a sense that even in the middle of real hardship, something isn't being fundamentally shaken the way it used to be. Something that used to depend entirely on things going well now persists, even when they don't. The sixth thing, a noticeable decrease in the compulsive need to be right, to win arguments, to have your version of events validated by other people. This shift often surprises people who knew someone before this process began because it can look, from the outside, like someone becoming less assertive or less confident when what's actually happening is closer to the opposite. A genuine decrease in how much someone's internal sense of okayness depends on external agreement or validation, freeing up enormous amounts of energy that used to be spent defending positions, correcting others, and needing to be understood in exactly the way you intended. The seventh thing, and the one that ties everything else together, a persistent, quiet sense of connection to something larger than the individual, isolated self. Not necessarily religious in any conventional sense, but a genuine felt experience of belonging to something bigger than the narrow, separate identity that most people spend their entire lives operating from by default. This might get described by different people using very different language: connection to nature, connection to humanity, connection to some larger consciousness or divine presence. But underneath the specific language, the actual experience tends to be remarkably consistent. A genuine loosening of the sense of complete separateness that usually defines ordinary human experience. I want to say something important about why these 7 experiences, taken together, represent something genuinely different from simply adopting spiritual language or aesthetic without any actual underlying shift. Someone can talk extensively about awakening, mindfulness, presence, and connection without any of these 7 things actually being genuinely present in their lived experience. The actual markers aren't in the vocabulary someone uses. They're in these specific, describable, recognizable shifts in how a person actually relates to their own thoughts, their own identity, other people's suffering, the present moment, external circumstances, the need to be right, and their sense of connection to something larger than themselves. I want to be honest about something important before we move into the second half of this conversation. None of these 7 shifts arrive all at once, in some single, dramatic moment of transformation, the way spiritual awakening often gets portrayed in popular media. They tend to arrive gradually, unevenly, sometimes with real setbacks and regressions along the way, and it's entirely normal to genuinely experience some of these shifts strongly, while others remain largely undeveloped, even years into a genuine, ongoing process. This unevenness doesn't indicate failure. It reflects the actual, honest texture of how this kind of change genuinely unfolds in real human lives, rather than the tidy, complete transformation often implied by more romanticized accounts of spiritual awakening. And that's exactly where we're headed in the second half of this conversation. What actually triggers this process to begin in the first place, why it so often arrives alongside genuine difficulty or crisis rather than during comfortable, easy periods of life, and what it actually looks like to continue deepening these 7 shifts over time, rather than experiencing them as a single moment that either happens or doesn't. Let's talk about what actually triggers this process to begin in the first place. because understanding the trigger explains something people find genuinely surprising once they hear it. Why spiritual awakening so consistently arrives alongside genuine difficulty or crisis, rather than during comfortable, easy periods of life when someone has more apparent bandwidth for reflection. Here's the core mechanism. The 7 shifts we described in the first half all involve in some form a loosening of the ordinary, tightly held structures most people use to organize their entire experience of life. The automatic trust in thought, the solid sense of fixed identity, the narrow focus on personal concern, the constant movement between past and future, the dependence on external circumstances for stability, the need to be right, the sense of complete separateness. These structures, however limiting they eventually turn out to be, are also genuinely functional for most of ordinary life. They help people navigate practical decisions, maintain consistent relationships, pursue long-term goals, and generally function within a world that mostly rewards exactly this kind of solid, consistent, externally validated sense of self. This means these structures rarely loosen voluntarily, simply because someone decides intellectually that they'd like to experience more presence or less attachment to being right. They tend to loosen specifically when something forces them to, and genuine crisis, loss, illness, the collapse of an identity or life structure someone had built their entire sense of self around, does exactly this, often more effectively than any amount of voluntary practice or intention ever could on its own. This is why so many accounts of genuine awakening trace back to a specific, identifiable crisis, a serious illness, a devastating loss, the complete collapse of a career or relationship that had been functioning as the primary source of someone's identity and stability. The crisis doesn't simply produce suffering, though it certainly does that. It also, often as an unintended consequence, forces exactly the kind of structural loosening that voluntary spiritual practice alone rarely produces with the same intensity or speed. I want to be careful here, because this explanation could easily be misread as suggesting crisis is somehow necessary or good, and that's not the actual claim. Genuine awakening is possible without crisis, through sustained voluntary practice, through gradual maturation, through simple, patient attention over many years without any single dramatic triggering event. But crisis-triggered awakening does tend to be more common, more sudden, and often more intense than the alternative, precisely because crisis does forcibly, rather than gradually and voluntarily, what these 7 shifts otherwise require deliberate, sustained effort to accomplish. Let's talk about what actually happens in the aftermath of whatever initially triggers this process, because the awakening itself, however it begins, is rarely a single completed event. It's the beginning of an ongoing, uneven deepening that continues, in most genuine cases, for the remainder of a person's life. Here's the first thing worth understanding about this ongoing deepening. The 7 shifts we described don't arrive as permanent, stable achievements that, once reached, simply remain in place indefinitely without further effort. They function more like capacities that need continued practice and continued attention in order to stay accessible, rather than fixed states that, once attained, never require further engagement. Someone can experience a genuine, powerful initial shift in any of these 7 areas, and still find themselves, months or years later, gradually sliding back toward old patterns without ongoing, deliberate practice to sustain and deepen what initially opened. This is one of the more important, and often disappointing, truths about genuine spiritual awakening that romanticized accounts rarely mention. It isn't a destination you arrive at once and then simply inhabit permanently afterward. It's closer to an ongoing relationship, requiring continued attention, continued practice, continued willingness to notice when old patterns are reasserting themselves, and continued effort to return, again and again, to whatever practices or perspectives originally opened these 7 shifts in the first place. Let's talk about what this continued practice actually looks like, because abstract encouragement to keep practicing isn't especially useful without some concrete sense of what that practice actually involves. For the first shift, the collapse of automatic trust in thought, continued practice looks like ongoing, deliberate noticing of thoughts as they arise, rather than assuming this noticing, once discovered, simply continues automatically without further attention. This might involve formal meditation practice, or it might simply involve regular moments throughout an ordinary day where attention deliberately turns toward observing thought itself, rather than being fully absorbed inside its content. For the second shift, the recognition of identity's constructed nature, continued practice often involves ongoing willingness to notice and gently question moments where the old, solid sense of fixed self reasserts itself particularly strongly, especially around ego-threatening situations like criticism, failure, or comparison, where the pullback toward rigid self-defense tends to be strongest. For the third shift, increased capacity for others' suffering, continued practice often involves deliberately maintaining engagement with the wider world, rather than allowing increased sensitivity to suffering to produce withdrawal or avoidance, which would actually work against the genuine deepening of this particular capacity over time. For the fourth shift, presence rather than time travel between past and future, continued practice typically requires ongoing, regular return to whatever specific practice originally helped access this presence, because the mind's habitual pull toward rehearsing the past and anticipating the future tends to be one of the strongest, most persistent patterns to fully release, requiring genuinely sustained attention over very long periods. For the fifth shift, stability independent of external circumstances, continued practice often involves deliberately testing this stability during genuinely difficult moments, rather than only experiencing it during comfortable, easy periods when circumstances aren't actually challenging it in any meaningful way. For the sixth shift, decreased need to be right, continued practice often involves noticing specifically moments of strong defensive reaction and treating those specific moments as valuable information about where the old pattern remains strongest, rather than treating any individual lapse as evidence that the entire shift has somehow failed or reversed. For the seventh shift, connection to something larger than isolated self, continued practice often involves deliberately maintaining whatever specific activities or relationships originally fostered this sense of connection, rather than assuming it simply persists on its own without any continued cultivation. I want to say something important about why understanding this ongoing, uneven nature matters so much, particularly for anyone who's experienced a genuine, powerful initial awakening and then felt discouraged or confused when old patterns eventually started reasserting themselves. This reassertion doesn't mean the original shift wasn't real or that something has been permanently lost. It reflects the accurate, honest nature of how this kind of deep, structural change actually works in a real human life, not linear, not permanent after a single breakthrough, but ongoing, cyclical, requiring continued patient return to practice again and again for as long as a person continues genuinely engaging with this process at all. I want to leave you with an image because I think it captures everything we've walked through across both halves of this episode. Picture a vast field, long overgrown with dense, tangled growth that's accumulated over many years, so thoroughly established that walking through it in any direction requires real effort, real navigation around thorns and roots that have grown thick and stubborn through decades of undisturbed growth. Somewhere in the middle of this field, a fire eventually breaks out, sometimes started deliberately, sometimes ignited by lightning, sometimes arriving through circumstances entirely outside anyone's control or choosing. And this fire, devastating as it looks in the moment it burns, clears something the overgrown tangle had made almost impossible to access. Open, visible ground, finally exposed after years of being completely hidden beneath growth that had simply always been there, unquestioned, taken for granted as the field's permanent, unchangeable state. But here's what's crucial to understand about that newly exposed ground, once the fire has finally passed. It doesn't remain clear and open forever, simply because it was cleared once, dramatically, by a single significant event. Left entirely alone, without any further attention or cultivation, that same ground will eventually, gradually, begin growing the same tangled overgrowth it had before, not because the fire failed to do its work, but because clearing ground and cultivating what grows there afterward are two entirely separate ongoing processes, and the first, however dramatic and significant, was never actually sufficient on its own to guarantee the second. What actually determines whether that cleared ground becomes something genuinely new, a tended garden, deliberately cultivated, consciously maintained, or whether it simply gradually returns to exactly the same tangled overgrowth that existed before the fire ever passed through, is what happens afterward. Continued attention, continued deliberate tending, continued willingness to notice new growth as it appears and decide actively what deserves cultivation and what needs, once again, to be gently, patiently cleared. The fire that first opens this ground, whatever form it takes in any specific life, is rarely something anyone actually chooses or controls. But the garden that eventually grows, or doesn't, in the space that fire creates, that part always remains an ongoing choice, tended one deliberate season at a time, for as long as anyone continues showing up to do the actual patient work of cultivation.